Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I want to send each and every one of you loads and loads of love, and I truly hope you're doing well. We really are getting to the countdown to Christmas because I think it's only 2 weeks until the big day, so I hope you've got your turkey ready, and I also hope you've done some Christmas shopping, although I don't know whether I'm going to be doing very much this year myself, because I think it's been kind of a weird year really. It's one that I don't think any of us will ever forget. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Natalie and I grew up in a small North American neighbourhood in a very standard symmetrical home that looked rather like a pretty doll's house from the outside, which was why all the locals in our area called the house that we owned the Dolls. I gather it was designed by a phenomenal architect of the time, which meant that every attention was given to the more modern styles of the interior living space, where emphasis was given to open-plan living, spacious bedrooms and sumptuous entertainment areas. We had a beautiful front and back yard that was always ablaze with beds of colourful blooms and large terracotta pots filled with bountiful displays of pretty, visually eye-catching flowers. My father at the time was passionate about gardening, as he always told us it enabled him to unwind and relax from the stress of the day after having dealt with very difficult customers. He worked as a manager of a large department store, dealing with customer complaints, inquiries and returns. He would describe some of the customers as so difficult, pernickety and demanding, which was why he believed his dark hair had invariably turned white after the first year in his job. My father was in charge of a small administrative team that dealt with all the issues that invariably arise in the store. But when they got out of control, he was the one always called on the scene to resolve the problem with the client. One of the customers who shopped at the store regularly was exceedingly problematic. She caused my father and his administrative team no end of trouble. She was a feisty elderly lady in her 80s called Mrs. Gwendolyn Harper, and she was always bringing back everything that she had purchased, like clothes she claimed were way too small for her, but were covered in briars, thorns and soil marks, as if she'd been wearing them on a hike or while she was doing the gardening. When she was told by customer services that they could not take the filthy garments back because they had invariably been used, she would claim that that was an outright lie and that was exactly how she'd purchased them from the store. "I can't help it if you choose to sell soiled garments in your store," she exclaimed. "I tell you now, young man, I never wore these clothes. They came exactly like this." Then she would bring back jars of expensive cosmetic creams that had almost been completely finished and clearly used in excessive amounts on her rather crepey, withered-looking skin. She claimed that the cream had caused her to break out in hives. "Dreadful stuff," she would complain bitterly. "You need to swap it for another jar. This one was clearly contaminated. Has someone got their filthy hands into the jar before I bought it?" My father's staff members would assure her that nothing could interfere with the cellophane wrapping, and then she would say something like, "Well then, it was clearly contaminated at the factory. You should talk to your distributors about such things. Now hand me another jar, dear." Sometimes my dad would agree to give the petulant, peevish woman a shopping voucher just to get her out of the store, because she wore down his jaded nerves like a rough piece of sandpaper wearing away at his resolve. She was such a cantankerous, prickly woman who no one liked at all, and whenever she came shopping into our store, every member of staff avoided her like the plague and pretended not to notice her, because dealing with her condescending manner, raspy, short-tempered voice was not for the faint-hearted, let me tell you. You definitely would describe yourself as having an off day if you dealt with the likes of the fiery Gwendolyn Harper. She would make the most even-tempered person pretty hot under the collar. I was raised by my two parents in our quaint little neighbourhood, with my older sister Danielle and my younger brother Frederick, and growing up we had an incredibly wholesome childhood because our parents were so interactive and very much involved in our lives. As a family we would go on outdoor excursions regularly and holidays, and we would go exploring and hiking in the Virginia countryside, or even further afield. I really adored West Virginia because it is such an exquisite part of the world to live, with stunning mountainous valleys, dreamy forests, rugged outcrops, silvery lakes, farmers' fields, and indigenous wildlife, and let's not forget so much more. One day when I was about 13 years old and my dad was driving our family car on a West Virginia highway at the dead of night as we were returning home from a camping trip, I remember my dad saying, "What the heck is that?" It all happened so fast as we watched this hairy giant-like humanoid creature. It was colossal in size and excessively burly and muscular, covered in long flowing auburn hair, and it dashed across the road at an uncannily fast speed, taking 5-foot strides. I observed it was swinging its overlong arms backwards and forwards. The critter turned to look at us for a very brief second, and that was when we noticed his human-like face and the red eye shine that emanated from his deep-set eyes. We watched the critter in awe as it literally bounded over the guardrail, down a grassy embankment to the wooded area beyond, and it moved with such a seamless grace. In that extraordinary, exhilarating second, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that we had observed a Bigfoot, and it was the most exhilarating moment of my entire young life. The first thing I remember my mother said was, "Wow, what a gorgeous creature! I wonder what on earth he is." As kids, my siblings and I were squealing at the back of the car, "We saw Bigfoot! We saw Bigfoot!" We were so ecstatic about our brief encounter. After such a surreal, scant experience, I had this huge yearning to have a one-on-one encounter with Bigfoot myself. I heavily researched the subject, much to the amusement of both my parents, who thought my fascination for Bigfoot was endearing. My mother reminded me over and over again that the odds of encountering a Bigfoot again were very much stacked against me, and I had about as much chance of seeing him again as winning the national lottery. I knew she was right, because by nature they're elusive and reticent creatures, so an opportunity of a decent one-on-one encounter with the ambiguous hairy man was indeed very slim. But even so, I wasn't going to stop hoping and praying that one day it might just actually happen. I did have a friend in West Virginia who claimed that she was terrorised by a Bigfoot on her property that kept pilfering their chickens and was exceedingly aggressive. But I assure you nothing she could have ever said or done could have dampened my enthusiasm and passion for finding this indefinable, bewildering, cryptid beast that had left an indelible mark on my life for such a minuscule chance encounter. Fast forward a few years, and by this time I was about 16 years old, and I took on a holiday job at my uncle's funeral home because he paid exceedingly well, and I could do with the pocket money. It would seem that the administrative assistant who dealt with all the paperwork regarding deceased estates had come down with a bad bout of pneumonia and had subsequently been hospitalised. I eagerly accepted the temporary job, which I did not think would be that difficult, as I was very good at dealing with people and answering phone calls. I rarely believed it would be a plain sailing and very simple job. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first week that I was in the offices, everything ran very smoothly, until it seemed that the funeral parlour was suddenly inundated with a large number of sudden deaths, which I gather sometimes does happen. It would seem that unfortunately, due to staff shortages, it invariably meant I had to get much more involved with parts of the job I had seriously hoped to avoid, like ushering in the frequent deliveries of dead bodies to the morgue for cold storage, and of course talking to relatives about the funeral arrangements for their loved ones. It was a very challenging time for me because people all react to death very differently, and dealing with raw emotions is never easy at the best of times. It rarely felt as if I'd been thrown into the deep end of a shark-infested tank. One day a very pretty auburn-haired, blue-eyed young woman who looked like a startled fish out of water entered the funeral parlour, and she told me that her grandmother was being autopsied downtown at the medical examiner's morgue because her manner of death was exceedingly questionable. "It'll be released to your funeral home later," she informed me, "once the medical examiner is finally satisfied with her findings. I just want to get cracking with the funeral plans, if I may." "Of course," I said. "Come this way." I gestured to the lady as she followed me into the office. "I know who did it," she whispered, "but I daren't tell anyone, in case I get sectioned." "You know who did what?" I asked the lady, as she sat down at the desk. "I know who murdered my grandmother," she said. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I looked at the young lady in surprise because it seemed to me so absurd that she would be keeping such a startling revelation from the police and confiding in me of all people. I mean, I was helping with funeral arrangements for her grandmother. Why was she telling me all this stuff? I wondered to myself privately. People think my Uncle Nell did her in because he despised her so much, she continued. But I saw the murder for myself. I was hiding, you see. I saw the whole thing before my very eyes. You should be telling the police this, I said, not me. It was Bigfoot who killed my grandmother. Do you think there's a chance in a month of Sundays they'll believe me? Whispered the girl. I honestly do not know why I'm telling you this, but I need to get it off my chest, and for some very strange, outlandish reason, I think I can trust you. When the lady told me that Bigfoot had killed her grandmother, I was intrigued, and I asked her to tell me absolutely everything. I could feel my heart fluttering in my chest with excitement, because this was as close to a personal encounter with a hairy man as I was ever likely to get. Well, I can't really blame the Bigfoot for what he did, said the lady. I mean, my grandmother was chasing after him with a pitchfork in the middle of the night because he was pilfering some of her apples from her trees, and she was incandescent with rage. You see, my grandmother is a very, very possessive woman, and she's as tight as you can get, so much so that she can't even bear to part with a few apples. She's that tight. Wow, I said. Now that is mean. The girl continued, all I saw at the time was this colossal, hairy creature running into the woods, and I actually thought it was a bear. My grandmother, she said, leaning forward, I don't wish to speak ill of the dead, but she was a horrible, horrible, nasty woman with a temper on her that was so bad that even her own farm dogs kept a wary distance from her. Wow, that's incredible, I said, especially for dogs. That evening I reluctantly decided to follow my grandmother into the woods, because she's very frail and not robust these days. She's in her 80s, you know, and so I was concerned that she would fall over and hurt herself, or be mauled by that bear she was chasing. Sometimes she has no common sense whatsoever. I mean, who in their right mind tries to antagonize a bear? But my grandmother was never in her right mind, so to speak. So I had to follow her in the woods, and I saw the huge creature standing there. And that was when I realised at once it wasn't a bear, but a Bigfoot. I was absolutely gobsmacked to see a creature like that out in nature. It was like the critter was waiting for her and was expecting some kind of interaction with my grandmother, which is incredibly peculiar because they're usually evasive and very elusive, from what I understand. But this one was behaving out of character for the species. I think he was so amazed that my grandmother was actually bold enough to chase after him. I mean, this thing was big, and when I say big, I mean colossal. It was covered in long, tawny brown hair, and it was like a humanoid ape with very overlong arms and powerful, strong legs, and a massive human-like hand, the likes that I've never seen before. This thing was easily over 1,000 pounds, I'd guess about 4 foot wide and about 9 foot tall, and it had a cone-shaped head and a very long angular face. I was terrified by this Bigfoot because, let me tell you something for nothing, you know when you're observing a formidable beast. This thing was enormous, and I sensed I was in the presence of a very dangerous apex predator. But my fractious, balmy grandmother was absolutely fearless and seemingly very aggressive towards the creature. She kept screaming at him, "No one steals my apples! You hear me? No one steals my apples! You hear me?" And she tried to attack the creature with her pitchfork, but she kept missing. "You are kidding," I said. "She did that to a Bigfoot. I'm not joking." I know this sounds exceedingly peculiar and off the charts crazy, and I can't fathom it myself, but I promise you that this Bigfoot actually seemed so fascinated and very impressed by my grandmother's courage. He didn't know that she was naturally a very pig-headed and confrontational person at the very best of times. The Bigfoot actually snatched the pitchfork directly from my grandmother's hands and threw it into the stream, and he did this with a distinct look of amusement on his face. I think he thought it was a big game. The pitchfork, I noticed, was being carried away by the strong current of the stream, and my grandmother, with her frail, wobbly legs, was thumping around in the darkness trying to grab the pitchfork, and she was nearly flying down the rocky alcove to the stream, but the creature caught her in time, because I guess he knew that she would harm herself and was about to fall over. You mean he rescued her? I asked in amazement. In my book, that's not murder. Well, the trouble is that the creature was so monumentally big. I think he was unaware of his own powerful strength, and as he pulled my grandmother away from the stream, with such a brute force to protect her, of course, his powerful movements literally snapped her neck. Imagine for a moment picking up an ant off the ground. It's an easy kill with one of those tiny creatures. You just have to pick one of them up and squeeze them with your fingers, even when you're not trying to do so. Well, it looked rather like that. So that was how my grandmother ended up being killed by the beast, but I know he did not intend her any harm. So she continued, it would seem that the Bigfoot, in his efforts to rescue my grandmother from falling over the rocky ledge to the stream, caused her extensive bruising, which the medical examiner deems very suspicious. I naturally couldn't tell anyone the Bigfoot did it, because they'll think I'm completely loopy, and I can't risk that to my reputation. You see, I'm studying law at university, and I don't want to be typecast as a fruitcake. Well, why don't you tell the police that you think a bear actually attacked your grandmother, I suggested, and then you don't have to mention the Bigfoot at all. That way it would explain the large bruises on her body. It's a win-win situation for everyone. Your uncle will get off the hook as a potential suspect, and the morgue will put down the cause of death as an animal attack, which is indirectly true. Good point, she said. Why didn't I think about that before? After all, when I first saw the Bigfoot, I did actually think he was a bear. Good point, I said. Tell me, what did the Bigfoot do when he actually realised that your grandmother was dead? I'm sorry, I'm a little curious about that. The funny thing is, he seemed really quite upset about it, and he kept trying to wake her up. He shook her body very violently and even slapped her cheeks, and he did make a very low guttural whining sound, as if he was rather distressed about it. It transpired that he realised that she was deceased, so he just glided away into the woods, and, oh my word, when he moved was he graceful. He was extraordinary to watch. I saw everything very clearly, because, you know, it was a very bright night with a full moon. I know the creature didn't intend to harm her, so it really was an accidental killing, if you like. Not really a murder. Of course it's not, and it's an extraordinary story, I said. You've no idea how thankful I am that you shared it with me, because I've always had a huge passion for Bigfoot, and I do not believe that all of them are hardened killers. I knew you would believe me, she said, looking delighted. I'm so glad to have been able to share my story with someone. I do feel so sorry for the Bigfoot, because I don't think it would have harmed my grandmother intentionally, but the trouble is he was rough with a frail old woman. I mean, she did have a replacement hip last year, so I think he was oblivious to how vulnerable she actually was. Well, why don't we get on with the funeral arrangements now, I suggested. The lady began to give me details for the funeral. It's unlikely anybody will be coming, she said, suddenly wiping away a tear. Everybody hated the whining, miserable old bat, so I think it's going to be me, the casket and the priest, and pretty much nobody else. I'm the only one paying the funeral costs because no one wants to cover them for her, and I don't want her to have a pauper's funeral. That would be terrible. Was she really that miserable, I asked, that no one will actually come to her funeral? I mean, that's ridiculously sad if you ask me. I'm afraid so. Even her own children are happy that she's expired. They hated her with a fervent passion, I'm telling you. What was her name, your grandmother, I mean? I said, scribbling down the funeral details on a form. Her name was Gwendolyn Harper. I know that name, I said. Oh, yes. I do believe that your grandmother was my father's most annoying client, always bringing everything back that she purchased with the most outlandish excuses. Your grandmother is the reason my dad reckons his hair went white. Why does that not surprise me? She laughed. A couple of days later, when finally the medical examiner had released the body of Gwendolyn Harper, concluding that an animal attack, like a bear, had possibly caused her tragic demise, I was determined to have a peek at the corpse for myself, So when her granddaughter eventually came to view the open casket, I offered to join her for moral support. That was the first time in my life that I've ever observed a dead body. The lifeless corpse of the frail old lady looked like a vacant vessel, and she did look like a very normal old lady, although there were very definite skull marks deeply entrenched at the corners of her mouth, which gave away that she was usually most often scowling. I know it sounds strange, but something very odd happened while we were standing there in the mortuary. I felt as if there was a blast of freezing cold air that suddenly entered the room. "It's her," said the granddaughter. "She's here. I can feel that she's not happy." It was an experience that left me feeling incredibly unsettled, because I know I never imagined it. When I told my uncle about the cold air that entered the mortuary, he told me that he had stories about the funeral parlour that would make my hair curl, so I never asked him to elaborate, because I didn't want to hear any of them. That night I actually told my dad about Gwendolyn Harper's funeral, and that no one would actually be attending it because she was despised by everybody. My father was moved to the point of tears, and even though he never liked Gwendolyn, he actually organised for over 20 people from his staff in the store to come to Gwendolyn's funeral. So they all came along. The priest asked anyone if they actually wanted to speak, so my father took that opportunity to get up onto the podium to say a few words. "It would be a very sad old world if we were all the same. It would seem that God has made us uniquely individual, and we should be grateful for the vast range of colours that make up the fabric of the human soul. Some colours we may warm to, and others may be cold, but every colour is significant and supremely special, because in God's sight we are all precious and valuable, as is indeed our dear sister Gwendolyn." I thought my father's speech was absolutely amazing, and although as yet I have not had a personal encounter with a Bigfoot, I am still hoping. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to thank you, Natalie, for such a phenomenal story. It blew my mind, and I'm quite sure that my listening audience is very impressed by this story. What an incredible twist of fate, that the very person that your father despised, that made his hair turn white, he ended up actually going to her funeral, because that's how compassionate and loving and forgiving he was. And certainly his speech really did bring food for thought, because it is true that even though we may all be different and some of us might be more difficult, he chose to show love to her, on her funeral day, which I just think was incredible. And what an amazing Bigfoot story. How phenomenal. And I do think that those creatures probably just don't realise quite how strong they actually are. Until next time, goodbye and good night.